I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Hey everybody, it's Chris here again for JOBLO.com with another edition of The Best Movie You Never Saw, and this week we're taking a look at the Ridley Scott, Michael Douglas movie Black Rain. In it, Michael Douglas plays a corrupt American cop who, along with his partner played by a young Andy Garcia, winds up in Japan after a prisoner exchange gone awry. With their former captive cutting a swath through the local Yakuza in an attempt to establish himself as the new Tokyo boss, the cops are forced into an uneasy alliance with a by-the-book local inspector played by Ken Takakura, who's probably one of the biggest stars in Japanese film history. In addition to Michael Douglas, Andy Garcia, and Ken Takakura, this co-stars Kate Capshaw and Yasuko Matsuda, who was a big star in Japan in the 80s and who this was the last role of before he passed away tragically young to cancer. Directed by Ridley Scott, this has a great soundtrack by Hans Zimmer. Now, Michael Douglas was riding high in 1989. Following his Oscar win for Wall Street and Fatal Attraction's boffo box office, he was considered one of the most bankable actors in Hollywood. Opting for a rare action role, grittier and more hard-edged than his turns in Romancing the Stone and The Jewel of the Nile, Douglas, with his Fatal Attraction producers Stanley Jaffe and Sherry Lansing, who would go on to run Paramount Pictures, hired Ridley Scott, then on a career downswing following Legend and Someone to Watch Over Me, to helm this stylish East meets West thriller, which would be shot on location in Japan. Despite critical acclaim and Douglas's star power, Black Rain was only a modest hit upon its release in 1989. It grossed $46 million, decent enough numbers for the era, but it wound up grossing far less than comparable action movies of the time, although worldwide it was a pretty solid hit, grossing an additional $88 million, while it also became a pretty hot rental on the VHS market. Nowadays, Black Rain remains popular amongst aficionados of 80s action cinema, although I'd imagine people that aren't into that genre probably know nothing about it. And I think it probably remains Michael Douglas's one real attempt to make an action movie on par with what Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger were doing at the time. Sandwiched between Douglas's more well-known vehicles, with Basic Instinct, another giant hit just a few years later, and coming along at a fallow time in Ridley Scott's career, it remains a movie that's rarely discussed in examinations of either. Now, Black Rain is an 80s gem for many reasons. For one thing, Michael Douglas aces his anti-hero part while introducing him by staging a motorcycle race while he rides along to a Greg Allman song is maybe trying a little too hard to establish him as a sexy rebel. It's notable that his character Nick Conklin is allowed to be sleazy and imperfect. He's under an investigation for being on the take, and with another actor in the lead, he'd probably be eventually vindicated. But we learn early on that Nick is in fact guilty. He was on the take. He's also shown, at first, to be something of a racist.
Did you translate every word? I want every word translated, you understand?
Yes, I understand.
Making derogatory comments about the Japanese, and often screwing up his own investigation with a mixture of ego and foolheadedness, all of which eventually gets his partner, played by the great Andy Garcia, decapitated in a really brutal scene. However, lest you think he's totally unlikable, Douglas does indeed make Nick three-dimensional, to the point that even if we know he's not far removed from the baddies he chases, he's essentially a good man, and his evolution is convincing. His relationship with Ken Takakura's more honorable Japanese cop, himself a victim of the rigid class system in Japan, is touching. It's the best thing about the movie, and Douglas initially treats him like a joke, but comes to realize that Takakura, who's like the Chow Yun-fat of Japan, is truly on his side and an honorable man. Meanwhile, Yasuko Matsuda's bad guy is among the scarier ones of the 80s, sporting this crazed look and a sense of sadism. Matsuda was, unbeknownst to the filmmakers and Douglas himself, terminally ill at the time, and he apparently knew this would be his last role, so he put everything he had into it. Likewise, Ridley Scott, who one might assume would phone in to him, which must have seemed like a routine assignment, instead infused Black Rain with oodles of style. His vision of Tokyo almost seems as futuristic as the Los Angeles of Blade Runner, and his eye, matched with Jan de Bont's cinematography and Hans Zimmer's amazing hard-edged score, makes this one of the most impeccably made action films of the era. And what's really interesting is that Ridley Scott, if you know his work, often has multiple cuts. And indeed, when Ridley Scott turned in Black Rain, it was way over length. As Sherry Lansing Lansing said on the Black Rain DVD, "I remember when Ridley showed us the first cut of the movie. It was about 2 hours and 40 minutes, and it was extraordinary, but this was his first cut, and we all knew he was going to go in and make the film under 2 hours. I mean, the texture of the movie, the performances, the visuals, the sound, we were thrilled. Then Ridley called us back, I don't know, 4 weeks later, and showed us a movie that was 1 hour and 50 minutes long. We looked at him and asked, 'What did you do?' And he said, 'What do you mean, what did I do?' I said, 'You took out all the good stuff. Why did you make it into this?' And he said, 'But I had to.' And indeed, he did have to. To make it under 2 hours, he had to take out some of the texture and some of the finest scenes in the movie. So we just said to him, make it the right length. It doesn't have to be under 2 hours. Just make it the right length. And as a note, folks, the final cut runs 125 minutes, and it's probably one of the few Ridley Scott movies that he hasn't felt the need to reissue in a director's cut because Lansing kinda gave him final cut. It just goes to show you that sometimes creative freedom isn't necessarily a bad thing, and people actually liked this movie quite a bit when it came out. Michael Douglas himself, in an interview again on the Black Rain DVD, said that, "I remember when the picture first came out, there were very influential critics who called it a racist film because of how it depicted the Japanese, and this really bothered me, so I called him up and asked him, 'Have you ever been to Japan?' Silence. 'No.' 'Then what do you think you're talking about?' Then a few weeks later, it gets nominated for Best Foreign Film in Japan. A very respected critic said, 'Well, this is the best Japanese film I've seen this year,' and that was a real compliment to Ridley." Now, I do think that Douglas may be exaggerating things a little bit, but I also think that Black Rain holds up really well as a time capsule of the 80s and a time capsule of a time when a lot of the technology and a lot of the commerce was going to Japan. Think of it back then. How many electronics did you buy that were made in Japan? It was booming at the time. And I think the movie is extremely evocative of that. People might be a little bit upset if you haven't seen this movie that I revealed that Andy Garcia dies. Thing is, in cop movies, especially cop movies of the 80s and early 90s, the younger, more experienced partner is always going to die. It's just a given. Even as a child watching Black Rain, I had seen enough of these movies to know that Andy Garcia was absolutely doomed. And as an action junkie, you almost look forward to the partner dying because it'll kick the hero into high gear. And yes, this movie definitely does that, but Andy Garcia is so damn likable and charismatic, singing Ray Charles with Takakura, who apparently loved Garcia off screen. And busting Douglas's balls that, you know what, you kinda want him to pull through. All this makes his eventual death all the more hard-hitting, with it being, in the annals of action movie murders, one of the most sadistic. I mean, Garcia literally loses his head. Oh boy. Black Rain is easily available on DVD and Blu-ray, and it's streaming on quite a few sites for free, and of course you can buy it on iTunes, Amazon, and more. And I would say this is probably worth a blind buy if you don't want to just watch it on a streaming site, because it really does hold up. As Michael Douglas himself said on the Black Rain DVD, you know, people always ask me in my career, what's your favorite movie? And I have to say, Black Rain is right up there for me for the unique qualities of the movie. The execution across the board was terrific. And Black Rain is another entry into this column that, yes, many of you may remember having seen when it came out, but if it's been a while, I urge you to check it out again, as it holds up really well. And to those younger readers who may never have heard of it, do you like Ridley Scott? Do you like Hans Zimmer? I mean, of course you like Michael Douglas, who doesn't? So, if it's yes to all those three, then boy oh boy, are you gonna love this. Until next time, for JOBLO.com, I'm Chris Bumbray.